Masechet Zevaḥim, Daf Mem He, Mishnah, Kodshe Goyim, En Chayevin Alehem Mishum, Pigul Notar V'Tameh, Ve'ashochtan Bachutz Patur, Dibre Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yoseh Mechayeb. So first of all, non-Jews are permitted to bring sacrifices to the Bet HaMikdash. They are kosher and they can be offered. This does not apply to all types of sacrifices, but as we will see, specifically to voluntary sacrifices. Certainly in Olah, a non-Jew says, I want to bring a Korban Olah. They can bring it, it's accepted, and it's offered by the Kohanim. However, not all of the stringencies that apply to Jewish korbanot apply to those brought by non-Jews. And therefore, if a non-Jew brings a korban, one is not liable as pigul, even if the Kohen has in mind that they will be consumed at the wrong time, it does not become pigul. If it's left over after the time and one eats it, one is not liable as notar. And if it becomes tameh, if the person is tameh when he is consuming it, or performing it, then he is not liable. And furthermore, someone who does shechita outside. For a regular korban, the shechita has to be in the mikdash, but this one, although it should be in the mikdash, if the shechita is done outside of the mikdash, there is no liability according to Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yoseh, however, says one is liable, at least for the last one. We'll see about all the others. Tenor Rabbanan, Kodshe Goyim, Lo Nehenin Velo Mo'alin, Ve'en Chayavin Alehem Mishum Pigul Notar V'Tameh. The Baraita expands on the Mishnah and says that sacrifices that are brought by non-Jews, no one is allowed to get benefit from it, lichatechila. However, if someone does get benefit from it, b'di'avad, it's not considered me'ilah. So again here, yes, it's acceptable. It is a korban, but it's not going to have all the stringencies. And so personal benefit, one is not liable as me'ilah. And furthermore, one is not liable for pigul, notar, and tameh, even if he has in mind the wrong thing or leaves it over, or it is tameh or eats it while tameh. If it's something that is edible, then he is not liable. Ve'en osin timura ve'en mebi'in nesachim aval korbanan ta'un nesachim divrei Rabbi Shimon. And the law of timura does not apply. So if a non-Jew makes this animal A holy and then tries to substitute it with animal B does not become holy. Unlike if a Jew does it, then animal A and B both become holy, and that is prohibited to do, and they both become holy. But for a non-Jew, nothing happens, only the first animal remains kadosh and not the second one. And a non-Jew does not bring libations by themselves. A Jew can say, I want to donate some wine, and then he could bring a wine libation. However, a non-Jew does not do a wine libation on its own. However, if he does bring a korban, he can bring wine together with the korban. All that is according to Rabbi Shimon. Amar Rabbi Yoseh, Ro'ani bechulan lehachmir shneimar bahen la Hashem. Rabbi Yoseh says, I think we should be stringent regarding all of these matters, because the pasuk says in Vayikra, anyone in the house of Israel or the strangers in Israel that brings a sacrifice, la Hashem. So that includes non-Jews. And it's called La Hashem, and therefore the korban of a non-Jew is considered totally kadosh, and therefore one would be liable to pigul, notar, tameh, and so on. Now, where when is there a machloket between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yoseh? That's only for animals that are consecrated to be holy, to be sacrificed on the Mizbeach. That's where Rabbi Shimon says, no, they have a lower level stringency, and Rabbi Yosef says, we treat them the same and they are liable. However, if a non-Jew donates something, not as a korban, but rather for the upkeep of the Bet HaMikdash, meaning for the monetary value of that animal, the same as if you donate money or anything else. So in that case, mo'alin bahen, that the value fully is dedicated and belongs to the Bet HaMikdash, and someone who decides to take it for himself will commit me'ilah, even according to Rabbi Shimon. Lo nehenin velo mo'alin. Now let's analyze the baraita. It says that one does not get benefit lechatechila, but b'di'avad one will not commit me'ilah. Lo nehenin midrabanan. So what do you mean lo nehenin? If you don't commit me'ilah, then why can't you get benefit from it? That's midrabanan. It's better to stay away since this non-Jew still did bring this korban. So don't try not to get benefit from it, although it's only a drabanan, and therefore there's no deoraita me'ilah. Velo ma'alin. Now, how do you know that there's no me'ilah mid deoraita? The Gemara me'ilah hayet mitiruma. Tibitiruma ketib b'nei Israel velo goyim. We learn from the word hayet meaning a sin. It says regarding the korban, regarding the law of me'ilah, vet asher hata min hakodesh, and it also says regarding tiruma v'shamur mishped v'yisuadav hayet. And so it says the word hayet in both. And regarding Terumah, it says that only applies to Bnei Israel and not to Jews, and therefore, just like Terumah only applies to Bnei Israel, so to Me'ilah only applies to a korban that is given by a Yisrael, not a non-Jew. Sacrifice of a non-Jew, one is not liable for pigul notar and tameh. My ta'ama, what's the source? That pigul avon mi notar, because another gezerah shava. We're going to learn pigul from notar. It says the word avon in both of them. Here's the pasuk regarding notar. V'achalav avono yisa ki et kodesh Adonai chilel. So here we have the word avon and regarding notar, and it says the same thing regarding pigul. V'aten notar chilul mitumah ubetumah keti b'nei Yisrael v'lo goyim. And also says the word chilul. We just saw that chilel regarding notar, and it also says the word chilul when it comes to tumah. And regarding tumah, pasuk says that applies only to b'nei Israel and not Jews and not non-Jews, and therefore, just as Tumah applies only to Jews, and through this this Gezerah Shavah, we learn that Notad only applies to the sacrifice of a Jew, and through this Gezerah Shavah Chet, we learn that that's also true regarding Pigul. And so through this double Gezerah Shavah, we learn that all of these laws only apply to a sacrifice of a Jew. Ve'en osin temura. And if the non-Jew tries to substitute his korban, it doesn't do anything. Mai ta'ama di'itkash temura le'maser behema. U'masar behema itkash le'masar dagan. U'masar dagan ketib b'nei Israel ve'lo goyim. What's the source? Because there is a hekesh between temura and maser behema. And maaser behema, the tenth of every animal, is juxtaposed to maaser of dagan. When you have grain, you have to give a tenth of the grain. And regarding the tenth of the grain, it says Bnei Israel, which means it applies only to Bnei Israel and not to non-Jews, and therefore we link back that all the way to temura. Now we ask, we ask, if something is learned already from a hekesh, from the fact that these two laws are back to back, can you link another hekesh to that? Generally, we say you cannot do that when it comes to kodashim. If you're learning things in kodashim, this is a more stringent area, and yes, you can make one hekesh, but you can't link A to B and then B to C also. And the answer is Ma'asar Dagan Holinhu. The grain of the Ma'aser of grain is actually not holy. You have to give it to the Levi. However, it doesn't actually have holiness. The Levi can sell it. He can give it to a non-Levi. And so, because it's not holy, it's Chulin. When it comes to Chulin, you can link A to B and B to C and so on. That answer will work when, in order to define what's considered a holy thing or a non-holy thing, if you say we follow the source. So the source here, the original law that you're learning everything from, the melamed, if that's chulin, and that's maaser dagan is chulin, then you say, as long as the source is chulin, then you can go A to B, B to C, and you can make a chain link. Then that's fine. fine. But there's another opinion that says when we want to see if this law is chulin or not, we look at the end result, the lamed, the thing that we are learning too. And in this case, that is for timurah, which is something holy, and therefore one cannot make a double link in things that are related to kodashim. La ma'asar behema chova she'en kavua la zemanhu v'chova she'en la zeman kavua Yisrael maitu goyim la maitu. Rather, we say instead that the answer is that ma'aser behema, a tenth that goes to a tenth of every animal, that is something that one has to do, but it doesn't have a fixed time. Whenever it comes around, one gives a tenth of an animal, and we have a general rule that something that is not a fixed time, a Jew can bring, but a non-Jew cannot bring. And so now this would be only one hekesh of the ma'asar behema with timurah. Now, what does this mean? En la zeman kavua. So, what is this going to exclude? What has a zeman kavua? So, the phraseology is not exact, but what it applies to is that a non-Jew can bring a neder or a nedava, which means at that time that they decide that they're going to make a neder, then they will have to bring that korban. So, non-Jews can bring a neder and nedava, and yes, those things will be sacrificed, but other things that are called not the time. Now, this in fact, a non-Jew cannot bring a holiday offering or korban chagiga, even though that's based on time. So this phrasing is hard to understand. But anyway, the point is that it applies to some things, but it does not apply to ma'asar behema, and therefore we can learn from there directly just with one hekesh, and one hekesh you can do even in something that is kodesh. Ve'en mevi'in nesachim, the Braita taught that non-Jews cannot bring libations by themselves. Tenor banan ezrach may be nesachim, ve'en hagoy may be nesachim. This is learned from this pasuk that says an ezrach can bring libations. So that means someone homeborn, referring to Jews, but not non-Jews. Yachol lo te'olato te'una nesachim tamodomar kacha. Now, does that mean when they bring an animal sacrifice that is not required to bring the wine libation together with it? When a Jew brings a sacrifice, he has to bring also a wine libation with it. So does that mean for a non-Jew we don't need anything at all? But the pasuk says kacha, that this is how it's done. This is how you perform the sacrifice, and it says exactly this way with libation. So therefore you do need it, and therefore although the non-Jew cannot bring a wine libation by itself, if he's bringing an animal, he can bring a wine libation, or if he brings the animal, then the Bet HaMikdash will provide from its storehouses the wine libation. Amar Rabbi Yosef, Ro'ani bechulan nachmir, bamed memorim bekodshe mizbeach bechule. Braita continued and said, according to Rabbi Yosef, he is stringent, meaning that he treats the korban of a non-Jew the same as that of a Jew, and therefore one would be liable to pigul and notar and tameh. And then it says this machloket is only regarding kodshe habayit. But if a non-Jew donates the monetary value of an animal, then one is liable to me'ilah. My ta'ama, what's the source? Kasabar, ki gamra me'ilah, chet mitiruma, dumya de tiruma de kedisha, kedushat haguf, abar kedushat bedek habayit, de kedushat amim la. Up above, we learned the law of me'ilah from the gezerah shava of the word chet, from tiruma. And we said before that teruma, there it says Bnei Israel, and therefore me'ilah only applies to a korban of Bnei Israel. However, that is true only if it's similar to teruma, in that it has kedushat haguf. Teruma is holy in and of itself, not only the monetary value. So too, this will only apply to an animal that is kedushat haguf, that is a sacrificial animal. However, if it's kedushat bedek habayit, then that's monetary value, and then that exemption for non-Jews does not apply, and that's why everybody agrees that something that is donated for its monetary value, one would be liable for me'ilah even if it's donated by a non-Jew. tenor banan, dam shenitma uzrako beshogeg hursa, bemezid lo hursa. A Baraita teaches that blood that became tameh, and nevertheless the Kohen sprinkled it on the Mizbeach. If he did it by mistake, then the Korban is still acceptable. If he did it on purpose, it's not acceptable. When do we say that? It's only not acceptable if it's an individual korban. We tell him, you got to go bring another one. But if it's for a public offering, an offering on behalf of the public, then whether the blood was sprinkled while tameh by mistake or on purpose, it's acceptable, because the seats of the Kohen Gadol allows such things to be acceptable if it's done. But when it comes to a non-Jew who brings a korban, it doesn't matter whether it was by mistake or on purpose, it's not acceptable. The seats will not make it acceptable. Amru Rabbanan kamed Papa keman delak Rabbi Yosef di Rabbi Yosef hamar becholan ani roeh leachmir. So the rabbi said this before Rav Papa and wondered, of course, whose opinion is this like? It must be it's not Rabbi Yosef, because Rabbi Yosef said that he is stringent in all matters to equate the sacrifice of a non-Jew to that of a Jew. And if he's equating it in all matters, then it should be totally equated, and therefore, in this case, it would actually be for benefit to say that for a non-Jew also we should make the same law as for a Jew, and therefore, in some of these cases at least, b'shogeg, it should be acceptable. Amar lehu Rav Papa, afilu tema Rabbi Yosef, sha'nehatam damar kera lahem velo lagoyim. Rav Papa says, no, actually this baraita can be according to Rabbi Yosef. And when the pasuk says that the seats of the Kohen Gadol will atone, it says it will make it acceptable for them. Lahem means for Bnei Israel, but not for sacrifices that are brought by non-Jews. And that's why, because it says the word lahem, the seats is only going to help out sacrifices that are brought by Jews. And that's why Rabbi Yosef would agree. For most laws, the sacrifice of a Jew and non-Jew is the same, but the law of the seats is different for them. Amar le Rav Huna beret Rav Natan Rav Papa, la me'ata asher hem makdishim, hachiname hem velo goyim. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Natan, challenged Rav Papa. What about the pasuk that says that they separate themselves from sacred items of Bnei Israel, which they consecrate to me? And this is referring to someone who is tameh, and it says someone who is tameh has to stay away from Kodesh. And now it says Asher Hem Makdishim, that if you say Lahem means only Bnei Israel, maybe you'll say that also Hem here means only Bnei Israel, and that would mean that only if a Jew makes something Kodesh, then someone Tameh will be liable for eating it. But if it's sacrificed, if it's sanctified by a non-Jew, then there's no liability. But Rabbi Yosef says that there is liability. He applies Tum'ah, prohibition, both to a sacrifice of Jews and non-Jews. If you're going to say lahem means only Jews, why not say that hem also means only for Jews? Ela amar Rav Asher, amar kera lerason lahem vegoyim la b'nehar sa'aninhu. Rav Asher explains that lerason, the seats of the Kohen Gadol, will make something acceptable to them, meaning to Bnei Israel. That applies to sacrifices that a Jew brings, where it has to be accepted for atonement. But for a non-Jew, the korbanot of a non-Jew are not used for acceptance, meaning for atonement, because a non-Jew does not bring a korban hatat or korban asham. Rather, they only bring a neder and nedava. And therefore, since atonement and acceptance for that is not needed, that's why the seats will not help them out in any case. So it's not because of the word lahem, which means only for a Jew and not a non-Jew. That's not a Bios's derivation, and therefore he's also not going to need to derive hem, Jews and not non-Jews, but rather it's because of the nature of the korbanot of non-Jews, since they are not used for atonement, therefore the benefit of the seats will not apply to them. Next Mishnah, Devarim she'en chayavin alehen mishum pigul, chayavin alehen mishum notar umishum tameh chutz min hadam. Now, if we go 2 Mishnayot back where we listed things that one is not liable if he eats it because of pigul. And these are things that do not have a matir. You're only liable to pigul, for example, a regular korban, where once you sprinkle the blood, then the rest of the meat you can use to put on the mizbeach for korban olah, or eat. The kohanim can eat it for a korban hatat, or people can eat it for a korban shelamim. So if it has a matir and has a consumable part, then one was liable to pigul if one had the wrong intention outside of time when preparing it. That, however, is only true for the law of pigul. But even those things for which one is not liable to pigul, let's just use the example of livona, the frankincense, because that's all burnt. There's no matir. It's not permitted after a matir. So all those things like frankincense, which there's no law of the pigul does not apply. Nevertheless, one is liable for notad and tameh. If one would have that levona and leave it over after the time and eat it actually after the time, not just intention, but actually eat it after the time has passed, or if someone who's tameh and eats it, then they will be liable. This is true for all the things on that list, except for blood. Blood is an exception, as we will derive on the next daf. Rabbi Shimon mechaye b'dabar shedarkan la'echol aval ha'esim v'alebona v'ketoret en chayavin alav mishum tum'ah. Rabbi Shimon says one is liable if he is tameh and eats anything on this list, but and anything that is kodesh, but only if it's something that is generally edible. But if it's trees, wood, and lebona, frankincense, and ketoret, spices, these are not edible things generally. And therefore, if someone is tameh and eats them, they are not liable. Tenor banan, leyachol lo yehu chayavin mishum tumah ela al davar sheyesh lo matirin ben laadam ben lamizbeach. Now, the Baraita is going to derive this law and propose, perhaps, is it possible that one would not be liable for eating something while tameh, except if it's something that has matirin, meaning in a regular case where you put the blood on and then the meat is permitted to eat. So that's something that has a matir. In that case, if you eat that meat while tameh, one would be liable, and it doesn't matter whether it is something that can be consumed for a person or for the mizbeach. So I might think that the tumah only applies to things that have a matir, just like pigul also applies only to things that have a matir. I might think that the laws are equal, meaning against this Mishnah. Vedinhu, and in fact the Braita is going to back up this hypothesis with a kal vachomer. Uma pigul shu b'kbi'ah u'bidi'ah achat velo hutar mikelalo en chayvin alav ela al davar sheyesh lo matirin ben la'adam u'ben la'behema. Regarding pigul, it has a lot of stringencies, which one of them is that if for the liability for pigul, if doing it by mistake, if on purpose is karet, but if you do it b'shogeg, one brings a fixed korban as opposed to an olev yored. We'll see all this, the contrast with tumah in a second. For pigul, one has to have awareness only at the end. You don't have to know that about the law of pigul from beforehand, but rather after you did it, and then you realize, oh, now I learned that was pigul. And then one is liable to bring a korban, and there are no exceptions to the law of pigul. And yet, one is only liable for something that has a matir, whether that matir will allow the rest of the item to be consumable to a person or for to be placed on the mizbeach. So if that's true for a stringent law, then tum'ah shehi be'olev yored. If someone eats something holy while tameh, then by mistake the korban is only an olev yored, which is less stringent because not always an animal. It could be a bird or a meal offering. Ubishtei yediot, and for that it's harder to be liable because you have to have awareness of impurity before and after. Beforehand, I knew that I was impure. Then I forgot. I ate it, and then I realized again after. But if I never knew I was impure to begin with, then there's no liability to a korban. And so that's another leniency. And v'utra mikelala, there are exceptions when everybody or most people are tameh, then they can bring a communal korban like korban Pesach, and they're eating it while tameh. So there are exceptions to this rule. So if tumah, which is more lenient, all the more so, enodin sheno chayav ela al davar sheyesh lo matirin ben ladam ben lamizbeach, all the more so it should be true that one is not liable for eating while tameh, something that does not have a matir, right? One would be liable only for things that are matir, that make it the rest of it consumable to a person and a mizbeach. And if it's something like lebona and so on, the other things on the list, if for pigul one is not liable, all the more so for tumah one would not be liable because of this kal vachomer. That's what I might have thought based on logic. Talmud Omar asher hem maktishim li. Therefore, the pasuk in Vayikra 22:2, which is talking about eating things while tameh, says these extra words, asher hem maktishim, which comes to include all things that are made holy. They are going to be included in the prohibition of tumah, even if it's something that does not have a matir. Yachol miyad. Now, would this be true immediately upon doing shechita? When the animal's alive, there's no, we're not eating it, and it's not tameh. And so we're talking about after shechita, immediately after shechita, before the sprinkling of the blood. Now, if someone who is tameh eats the animal, eats the meat during that time, would they be liable? The answer is no. Talmud Omar yikrav. It says yikrav. Now yikrav, this is in the next pasuk after this one, 22-23. Now yikrav, maybe it means to just touch it, to come near it and touch it, but that can't be. Do you ever have a case where someone who just touches something is going to be liable to karet? The pasuk right after that says, well, someone who eats it is liable, so not someone who just touches it. Therefore, yikrav cannot mean just touching it. Yikrav means that it is ready to now be sacrificed, to be placed on the mizbeach. In other words, someone is only liable for eating some meat that's tameh if it has been prepared and is now ready to be placed on the mizbeach. But that's only after sprinkling. Between shechita and sprinkling, the meat is not yet ready to be consumed by the altar. It's not yikrav, and therefore the tumah does not yet apply there. Hakesad yesh lo matirin mi shikriu matirin en lo matirin meshigdash bekli, and therefore this can apply to all things. If it's something that has a matir, then you have to bring that matir, and you have to sprinkle the blood or the kemitzah, whatever, and then the rest of it will be now permitted for consumption. At that point, one would be liable to tumah. But if it's something that doesn't have a matir, let's say a mincha of a kohen, where all of the flour is sacrificed, in that case, once it's sanctified in a vessel, once one places the flour in a holy vessel, that's it. Now, already the next step is going to be putting it on the mizbeach. So it's ready to be put on the mizbeach. From that point on, one will be liable if one eats it while tameh. But we see that indeed the law of tumah applies to all these items, not only something that has a matir. Ashkechan tumah notar min elan. Good. We found a source for tumah that says mentioned in the Mishnah, but notar also, the Mishnah says, applies to all the items on the list. How do you know? Ata chilul metumah. A gezerah shava that we mentioned earlier on the daf says chilul regarding tumah and chilul regarding notar, and therefore we learn that that's the same. One is liable for notar, for lebona, and things like that. Velelef avon mipigol. Hold on. We also saw another gezerah shava earlier that says the word avon regarding pigul and notar. So maybe that we should employ that gezerah shava and say that just like for pigul, one is not liable for something that has no matir, so too for notar, one would not be liable if he eats it, if it's something that has no matir. Mistabera mitumah have lemelaf sheken gimel zayin lamed siman. It makes more sense to compare notar to tum'ah, and therefore all these things on the list that have no matir will also be prohibited, because notar and tum'ah have in common, gimel, that the prohibition is in the body of the offering itself and not just intent, caused by intent. Pigul is just caused by intent. not something with the body of the prohibited item itself. Zayin is that they don't depend on zerika, whereas pigul, although if one has improper intention anywhere along the line of the four services, it doesn't become pigul until you finish and do the final zerika. Then it becomes pigul, whereas that's not true for notar and tameh, where it can become tameh or notar even if one did not do the zerika. And the lamed stands for chilul. In both cases, the Torah uses the language of chilul. Adraba, mepigul havale lemelav sheken notar sis tahor bizman kareb vehane nefishan. Wait, if you're going to compare what it's more like to what it's more like, then you'd actually compare notar to pigul, because, and you should learn that just like pigul, there are these exceptions. If there's no liability if there's no matir, so too for notar, there's no liability if it's something that has no matir. Because regarding pigul and notar, we have what the common denominators, both of them have notar. Here it means it's permitted. That there are exceptions where there are no exceptions where it's permitted. Unlike Tumah. Tumah, if everybody's tameh, then it's permitted. But pigul notar do not have that. The seats of the Kohen Gadol will help out when there is Tumah. But the seats does not help for pigul and notar. So pigul and notar have that in common. Tahor, pigul and notar apply even to food that's tahor, as opposed to tameh. Bizman, it depends on time. Pigul and notar. Notar is when it actually passed the time. Pigul is when one has intention to consume it after the time. But both have to do with that deadline. Karev, both pigul and notar have to do with the item that's being sacrificed, not with the person, not with the sacrificer, he is tameh. V'hane nefishan, and therefore the similarities between pigul and notar are more. And so, if anything, if you're going to compare one by one, then we should learn from pigul to notar. So that can't be the source that one is liable for notar in all these items where there is no matir. אלא מדתנא לוי, דתנא לוי מניין שאף בפסול זמן הכתוב מדבר תלמוד לומר ולא יחללו את קודשי בני ישראל. Rather, it's from a baraita from Levi, who says, regarding the pasuk in 22:2, that's talking about Tum'ah, how do we know that this pasul that this pasuk is also referring to psul zman? Psul zman is referring to notar, something that is left over after the time, that this pasuk refers not only to tum'ah, but also to notar, because a pasuk a little bit later in the same perek says, velo yechalelu, and that's in plural, and therefore that teaches, bishne chilulin hakatu medaber, echad pesul notar, vechad pesul tum'ah. So therefore there's two things that will become profaned, and that is tum'ah, which this pasuk says explicitly, and the other will be notar, and so that is the derivation for the law in the Mishnah, that if there's something has no matir, then although a pigul does not apply to it, but the prohibitions of tum'ah and notar still do apply. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.